Buonasera a tutti. Good evening, everybody. My name is Ermelinda Campani. I'm the director of the program, and I'm delighted to welcome you all back to Stanford University. In fact, to the Breyer Center for Overseas Studies of Stanford University here in Florence. Tonight's lecture, whose title you see up there, is delivered by Professor Jonathan Payne from Stanford University. Let me say a few words about Professor Payne, who's our faculty on site in Florence this quarter. So he and his wife Ellen and their two children are spending the quarter here with us in Florence. Professor Payne is Associate Professor of Geological and Environmental Sciences and Biology at Stanford University. He's Associate Chair of Stanford's Department of Geological and Environmental Sciences. He's also the affiliated faculty member of Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, a hub for faculty, researchers, and students to collaborate on global sustainability research. Professor Payne's research is focused on the interaction between environmental change and biological evolution, using fossils and the sedimentary rock record. He asks, how does environmental change influence evolutionary and ecological processes? And conversely, how do evolutionary and ecological changes affect the physical environment? To answer his questions, Payne looks at catastrophic extinction events and their immediate aftermath up to a few million years. He also investigates the time scale of geological periods and eras lasting 10 to hundreds of millions of years. This quarter, Professor Payne, as I mentioned before, is teaching a class entitled Mass Extinctions and the Geology of Italy. He holds a PhD from Harvard University in Earth and Planetary Sciences. He has an MA also from Harvard University, whereas his BA in Geosciences was from Williams College. Thank you so much, Professor Payne, for having accepted my invitation to offer this talk. Thank you.
It's nice to get applause when I haven't even done anything yet. Thank you. So this is an interesting exercise for me because I almost always give lectures to professional audiences, right, to other geologists. So when I sat down to write this talk, I realized that I imagine, is anybody in here a geologist? Okay, good. We get a couple. Okay, so I've done my best to try to make everything accessible to a very general audience. But please stop me and ask questions as we go if I'm being unclear, because there's really no point in you being here and me talking if we're not communicating to each other, or at least I'm not communicating to you. So as Linda mentioned, much of my research is focused on mass extinction events in the fossil record. And my hope for this talk is to give you some perspective on what's happening today based on what we know from deep time. Okay, so let's see if this works. There we go. Okay, so we share our planet with an enormous diversity of organisms, and these organisms and their ancient relatives have been on the planet for most of its history. Right? Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. We've had animals on the planet for about 600 million years. We've had people on the planet for just about 250,000 years, so we're a very, very new addition to a very old planet. We're a new addition. We seem to be changing the planet quite a bit, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And I'm sure many of you have seen in the news many headlines claiming that the world faces a mass extinction right now, that particular species are close to extinction, that particular groups of animals are close to extinction, and that in particular we have evidence that the terrestrial animals have been affected by human activity for some time, for at least the last 10,000 years or so. In the oceans, we're getting evidence that the amount of human impact is increasing as well. And many people, as they start to talk about what's happening now, are referring to the current diversity crisis as the Sixth Extinction, implying 5 before that. It's showing up in books by professional scientists such as Richard Leakey, by science reporters such as Elizabeth Colbert. It's showing up as the title of novels. And it's even the name of a band, which I discovered when I was making this talk. So the idea of the Sixth Extinction appears to be, if not pervading popular culture, at least diffusing through it. Seems like I need to point this. Okay, so what I wanted to do is to see, what perspective can we lend to the Sixth Extinction from the other 5, or at least from a couple of the other 5, by going back into the fossil record and taking a look and seeing what fossils can tell us about biodiversity crises in the past. Okay, so lesson 1 from the past is going to be that mass extinctions have happened, and therefore they are possible and can happen again. Okay, and so this will be a short lesson. So basically how we figured this out is paleontologists over the years have gone back through the fossil record and looked at which fossils show up in which parts of geological time. One thing that may be useful to point out right here is that time is going from the bottom of this chart to the top of the chart. And we do this because that's how sediments are deposited. Right? So if we think about going out and looking at rocks, the oldest sediments end up on the bottom and the younger ones end up on the top. And so instead of time going across the bottom, in most geological diagrams, time goes bottom to top. And we have lots and lots of fossils from the fossil record. If we go back through and look at when the first occurrence and the last occurrence of species, or in fact genera or families of animals occur, we can figure out how diversity has changed over time. And so not the first graph to attempt this, but the first one to do this at very high resolution was in a study published in 1982 by 2 paleontologists from the University of Chicago. And they showed the diversity of marine animal families over the last 600 million years. So you can see time goes from 600 million years ago on the left over to the present day on the right. And they've numbered conveniently for us 5 different spots where diversity has dropped dramatically. And this is where the big 5 mass extinctions come from. Now, for people who are mathematically inclined, you might look at this and say, well, you could have a drop in diversity either because a lot of things went extinct, or because there was some origination process that just stopped, right? So we didn't have an unusual number of extinctions, we just had unusually few originations of new families. So Raup and Sapkowski were well aware of this, and so they also provided another graph showing the number of extinctions versus time. And this is where the big 5 come from, right? So there's one big extinction at the end of the Ordovician period. This is the runt of the litter, the late Devonian extinction, which is actually a series of stages with high extinction. This is the third one, the End Permian extinction. In their graph, it shows up as 2 different extinction events. It turns out that this is really just one event at the end of the Permian, and there's something happening in that time interval before, but it's not actually that big. There's an extinction at the end of the Triassic period, and then there's the very famous extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, right? So this is when the dinosaurs went extinct. Okay. And so, So they were working with a data set of marine families, right? So families are groups of related genera, genera are groups of related species. And so this isn't a count of the number of species, it's a count of the number of families. When we talk about the modern, we often want to know about the number of species that are going extinct. Very few people create headlines around the number of families going extinct. And so what Raup and Sapkowski did is they said, well, if we assume that species are going extinct in some sort of random fashion, how many species need to go extinct to remove entire genera or entire families? And so when they went through and made an estimate of this, and the basic point is that you need to remove a lot of species to get rid of 50% of families, as we see at the end of the Permian, right? Because if even one species in a family survives, the family is still around, right? And so you need something like 88 to 96% species extinction to get 50% family extinction. So some of these past mass extinction events were very, very, very severe events, right? Where more than half and much more than half of the species on the planet went extinct in a geologically short period of time. Okay, so Lesson 1, diversity can be lost. It has been lost. And major mass extinction events, fortunately, are fairly rare events. These are the kinds of things that happen once every 100 million years, right? So if you think about rare things in your own life, rare things in human history, those are very, very common events. For example, a 1 kilometer sized asteroid hits the Earth about every million years, right? Those happen a lot compared to major mass extinction events. The waiting time between these events is very large, meaning if we cause one, that's very unusual. These aren't the kinds of things that happen every day. Okay. The most severe extinction events have eliminated up to as much as 95% of the species on the planet. So 19 out of every 20. Okay. Lesson number 2, fortunately, is nice, which is we're not there yet. Okay. And there are a couple of ways of seeing this. So here is an estimate from Tony Barnosky in a recent review paper in Nature. And what he showed is here's the estimated species loss for the big 5 mass extinctions. And then in white over here is the percent of species that have been lost from a whole bunch of different groups. So we've got mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, bony fish, corals, snails, clams, cycad trees, conifer trees, sharks, and decapod crustaceans, right? So lobsters and crabs and their relatives. And so you can see that most of these numbers are down close to 0 and 1%. The black, so these are the ones that have actually been lost in the last 500 years due to, for any reason, but almost entirely due to human activity. In black, though, are the number that are considered threatened, or the percent considered threatened by the IUCN, which goes through and assesses extinction risk in species. And so what we can see is that there are substantial percentages of species at risk in many, many groups. Some of the groups have been very completely assessed, such as the birds and mammals. Other groups, such as the snails and clams, only a tiny, tiny fraction have been assessed. For example, in clams, there are about 30,000 living species of clams. About 100 of them have been assessed so far for extinction risk. So, in some sense, we have almost no idea what the total distribution of extinction risk is. But even if every species considered at risk went extinct today, we still wouldn't be at the level of these major mass extinction events. And so that doesn't mean we can't get there, but it at least means that we're not committed to that yet, even if we assume that every species on the planet considered even vulnerable to extinction is going to go extinct sometime in the next century or millennium. Okay. So the challenge there is that that's a comparison of species-level measurements on the modern with estimates of species-level extinction in the past. And so one thing that I've been working on with some collaborators, and I apologize that this is sort of a low production quality figure, we're working on this right now, is we're trying to figure out if we compare genus extinctions in the modern to genus extinctions in the past where we have direct data, how do we match up? And so you can see the little red dot here is sort of the best case scenario for the modern, which is if only the things that are considered where all of the species, only genera where all species within the genus are considered threatened go extinct. And anything that hasn't been assessed, we're going to assume is going to survive. That essentially our assessments have focused on the species at highest risk, and so we'll assume that risk is very low in non-assessed species. If we say that any genus that has at least one species at risk is at risk of extinction, then we get this next red dot. So you can see we're still very low compared to historical extinction percentages. And then if we go up to sort of worst case scenarios where we say, okay, what we've assessed so far is just representative of everything else that's out there. And so if we have 40% at risk of what we've assessed, then we have 40% at risk across the entire biota. We'd get up to the highest red dot. And so you can see again, even under the worst case scenarios, comparing apples to apples, it would be bad, right? The worst case scenario is pretty substantial, but it's not the end Cretaceous. Right? So the end Cretaceous would be this dot, for example. So there's still margin for error, I guess, is the lesson here, right? We're currently very far below the big 5, right? We're not the sixth extinction yet. There's a chance we could get there. Hopefully, we won't. Okay, and the big uncertainty there is assessment. That we still have major diverse groups of animals that are poorly assessed. Okay, The bulk of my talk now is going to be on some commonalities that we're finding between some of the past mass extinctions and what's happening today. Okay, so End Cretaceous mass extinction I'll talk about very briefly, because the key evidence for this was actually discovered in the town of Gubbio, just north of Perugia, so only about a 2-hour drive from here. And this is where Louis and Walter Alvarez, both from the University of California at Berkeley, which I'm told is near Stanford somewhere in California, they discovered high levels of iridium in a clay layer that they're pointing to in these rocks in the Bottaccioni Gorge just outside of Gubbio. And it turns out the only way to get that much iridium into these rocks and to have it show up in all kinds of other places around the world is to bring it in an asteroid. Basically, most of the Earth's iridium is in the core, and so there's not a good way of getting it out to the surface. And so they found this, and they created a firestorm of media attention by claiming that this mass extinction event was caused by an impact. It was controversial for a while. At this point, there are a few people who argue that there are other factors involved, but the vast majority of people working on these problems would say that this impact event is what caused the extinction. There's probably not a lot to learn from that, right, in terms of the modern. Not a lot of commonalities between what we're doing and a large object slamming into the planet. But what's interesting is we know what to look for now, and we have not found evidence of impact for any of the other 4 big mass extinction events. So I'll spend a bit of time, as a graduate student, I got very fascinated with the End Permian event, because when you look at this graph, one thing you notice is, the End Cretaceous has dinosaurs, but the End Permian was much worse. And so I was curious to see what we could learn about what caused that. And so my students and I have spent quite a bit of time in South China. And here's a bunch of us, so Ellen Schall, Katja Meyer, Li Xiaowei, and Fu Hongbin, standing, and they all have their fingers right on the horizon where the End Permian extinction happens. Right? So they're doing the same thing as the Alvarez group. They're pointing at that level in the rocks where the End Permian extinction shows up. And so if we zoom in, it looks like this. And for the non-geologists in the audience, the key feature you should be looking at is this change in color that runs across the rock outcrop here. And what you're seeing is this part of the rock that's lighter colored, this has a very high diversity of marine animals and algae and protists, so single-celled eukaryotes that make shells in the limestone here. Then there's the surface, and the stuff above it is essentially lithified slime. This is bacterial mats that have turned into rock, and you can see a pen here for scale, right? So we're seeing a few tens of centimeters. In fact, this level goes up for about 20 meters, and it's about a kilometer worth of rock before diversity starts to increase again. So several million years. So like the End Cretaceous, there's a very abrupt place in the rock record where you can put your finger and say, this is where the End Permian extinction happened. Okay. And here's an example, a study from South China, where all of these little vertical black lines are the observed ranges of species. So you can see there are about 350 species at this particular outcrop. And you can see that many of them share the same time of last occurrence right here. And some of these probably went extinct at the same time as well, but just weren't sampled in the last couple beds before the extinction. So the key point is this is a very rapid loss of diversity. And there's been an enormous amount of work on the End Permian extinction over the last 5 to 10 years. One study that came out just last year has shown, for example, that the time involved with the loss of all those species is just about 60,000 years at most. And so geologically speaking, that's very short. Okay, remember the interval of animal history is 500 million years, so we've got a very long interval. When we study biodiversity, we really just break it up into 5 million year intervals, because that's about as well as we can do globally for subdividing time. So to show that out of that 5 million years of the late Permian, the biodiversity loss happened in the last 60,000 years is showing that it's a very rapid event at the very end of this last Permian stage. And so you can see here, the big change that's happened is the increase in precision of these radiometric ages. So we have 251.941 plus or minus 0.037 million years just below the extinction, and 251.88 just above. When I started graduate school, the errors on these were plus or minus a million years. And so the instrumentation has just improved enormously, and that lets us refine the time scale dramatically. So now we know this is a very fast event. And similarly, if we think about commonalities to the modern, we know in the modern, for example, if we go out and radiocarbon date mammoths and horses in North America, for example, there's a very rapid interval of diversity loss, and this is in blue. It happens basically when we start getting evidence of human habitation in North America, for example. And the story is quite similar for all continents except for Africa. Okay. So another thing that we've learned, again, just in the last couple of years is about climate change during the End Permian. So one of the things that we can do in these ancient rocks is we can pull out fossils. In this case, these are fossils of fish teeth, essentially. And we can go into the fish teeth and we can look at the isotopes of oxygen that are in the fish teeth. So many of you will remember from high school chemistry class that oxygen comes in a couple different flavors. And they differ just in the number of neutrons that are in the nucleus. And the key thing is that their chemistry differs just slightly. So they do all the same chemical reactions, but the rates of the reactions differ a little bit depending on how many neutrons are in the nucleus. And what that means is that those rates are actually temperature dependent. So we can go into these ancient teeth, we can measure how much oxygen 18 and how much oxygen 16 are in the teeth, and we can reconstruct ocean temperatures. So here's a record from South China from the same site showing sea surface temperatures about 23 degrees Celsius going up toward the extinction event. And then as we go just across the extinction event, the isotope ratios change and they imply temperatures of 30 to 33 degrees Celsius. We're looking at almost 10 degrees Celsius of climate warming across this extinction. So very, very rapid warming. And we've also measured actually the carbon isotopes from these rocks, and this shows essentially that there's a large disturbance to the global carbon cycle at the same time we see this very rapid warming. I imagine that'll make sense to many of you, knowing that one of the major controls on climate is the amount of CO2, of carbon in the atmosphere. Okay, and so if we look forward in time, we can see that there's similarities again to the End Permian and projections of climate change over the next century to a couple of centuries. That under most scenarios of fossil fuel burning, we expect the Earth to continue to warm by several degrees Celsius. Again, maybe some good news is, we don't see 10 degrees C on this scale. We do see 5 or 6. So again, we're not quite there yet. Another thing that we see at the end of the Permian is selectivity. So if we divide up animals into a couple groups, so animals who don't have calcium carbonate skeletons, so that's us, right? We use calcium phosphate for our skeletons. Animals that use calcium carbonate but have essentially a lot of flesh inside. So these are the things you would eat, like clams and snails. And then the things that don't have much soft tissue and have very heavy skeletons. These are things you don't eat, like brachiopods and corals and echinoderms, right? For the most part. So what we see is at the End Permian, those non-carbonate bearing animals have about 10% genus extinction, which is pretty bad, but not too bad. Clams and snails lose about 50%, which is a catastrophe under most times in Earth history. But they do a whole lot better than the corals and their friends, who lose about 90% of genera. And so when you go out to the seashore today and you pick up clams and snails, that's because of the End Permian extinction. Before the Permian extinction, we had different groups of corals, and we had a lot of animals called brachiopods that actually would have been your seashells if you went to the seashore to collect things. Clams and snails took over the world because of this selectivity at the end of the Permian. And so we're still living with the consequences of whatever happened 250 million years ago here. Okay. And so one way of driving that kind of pattern would be to acidify the oceans. And so one thing that we've done in my lab over the last couple of years is to spend time trying to test the possibility that the oceans change pH across this event. Of course, we don't have 250 million-year-old seawater, so we can't go out and measure that directly. But for reasons that I won't have time to go into, we can figure that out or back that out by looking at the isotopes of calcium. And so one theme is that a lot of Earth history is actually going and measuring isotope ratios in ancient rocks. So in this case, two people in my lab, Jessica Hinojosa, who is a co-term master's student in my lab, and Juan Carlos Silva Tamayo, who is a postdoc in the lab, spent a lot of time measuring calcium isotopes in rocks and in fish teeth. And the basic thing that we did is we figured out that there are different predictions for how the calcium isotopes should behave under different scenarios. The one I'll draw your attention to is this ocean acidification. where essentially we expect a negative shift in this calcium isotope ratio. And so we went out and we measured these rocks, and it turns out this is a very hard measurement to make. The person who does it best in the world is over at Berkeley. They seem to have a lot of really good people there. And so we've been sending people from our lab over to Berkeley to work with Don DePaolo to make these measurements. And the answer that we got was that the calcium isotopes do shift to more negative values at the time of the extinction, suggesting that we are looking at an interval of ocean acidification at the same time that we see this extinction and climate warming. And so again, if we look at the oceans, unlike climate warming, which is uncertain to some extent due to feedbacks in the climate system, so how do changes in clouds affect the reflection of sunlight, and these kinds of things affect how much warming we expect. The chemistry of ocean acidification is very straightforward, and so if we know how much carbon dioxide we're adding to the atmosphere, we know how much the ocean is going to acidify. It's not nearly as uncertain as climate. And if we project forward over the next couple of centuries, we expect substantial drops in ocean pH, and that's going to affect how easy it is for animals to make their calcium carbonate shells. So the kind of selectivity we see at the end of the Permian looks like the kind of selectivity that we may expect due to human-driven environmental change. Okay. The other thing that we see in the rocks at this time, and people have known about for several decades, is that as you go across the Permian extinction horizon, in many environments, you go from these nice white-colored limestones into these dark-colored shales. And essentially, to geologists, dark-colored shales mean no oxygen on the seafloor. So the dark color comes from some minerals and often from organic matter that's being preserved because there's no oxygen for animals and bacteria to break it down with. And so that tells us locally that there's anoxia. People have also done things, very clever things, like measuring organic molecules in ancient rocks. And some of those molecules actually turn out to be the photopigments of bacteria that photosynthesize in the absence of oxygen. And so we can actually use these fossil molecules to show that there was no oxygen, even in very shallow waters in the ocean. And so you had bacteria that are photosynthesizing in the absence of oxygen. And of course, this would be bad news for animals, right? Animals need oxygen to breathe. And so if this was going on, this would certainly explain parts of the extinction. The problem is that both the organic molecules, which, let's see if I can go back. Okay, so both the organic molecules, which are reported in this graph here, and the black shales are really local measures. They tell you that there's no oxygen at that spot that you're looking at. But of course, we don't have most of the surface of the Earth preserved from the Permian. And so what we want to be able to do is to get measures of what's happening at a global scale, something that integrates over the whole planet and gives us an average measure, even though we're measuring one spot. And so this is where it turns out that uranium can do this for us. And so we've gone in and measured uranium isotopes. And I say we in a broad sense. I helped collect the rocks. The people who did the work are Kim Lau at the top, who's a PhD student in my lab group, and Kate Maher, who's a colleague of mine in geological and environmental sciences. And so Kate and I are actually co-advising Kim as a PhD student. And Kate runs one of our isotope facilities at Stanford and is an expert on uranium chemistry. So they're the ones who did the chemistry. I've been enjoying the ride. And the nice thing is we can make predictions about how uranium should change under anoxia. And again, for technical reasons that I can go into if anyone's curious later on, we expect both the amount of uranium in the limestone and the ratio of uranium-238 to 235 to change if we have an increase in the extent of anoxia in the oceans. So we went into our rocks and we measured that, and sure enough, we found both a drop in the uranium isotope ratio, the 238 to 235 ratio at the extinction event, and we saw a drop in the amount of uranium that was in the rocks as well. And so those two things together provide a strong indication of a big shift toward very widespread anoxia at the time of extinction. And so interestingly, locally there are many, many reports these days of anoxia in shallow marine waters. In the modern oceans, all these red dots here around the coasts. Almost all of this is coastal right now, and that's because almost all of it is driven by fertilizer runoff, right? So we have river systems that are draining areas where there's a lot of agriculture. When we have intensive agriculture, we tend to fertilize, and some of that fertilizer gets used up by the plants, which is great. Much of it runs off into the ocean where it's used up by algae, and those big blooms, when they start to decay, draw up all the oxygen that's in seawater as bacteria break down the algae. And so what we end up with are dead zones where there are areas of the coastal ocean where there's very low oxygen. And again, that area becomes uninhabitable to animals. Generally today, these are seasonal events because they happen during the times when the fertilizer is running off. But as the climate warms, that's going to affect the amount of oxygen that's soluble in seawater, and so these areas may expand over time. Okay. And so of course, there weren't people driving all this back in the Permian. It turns out that it looks very much like the cause of all of these changes was the eruption of a very large volcanic province called the Siberian Traps. Okay, I started at 5:30, right?
Yes, you
Okay, I saw 6 and I was suddenly terrified. Okay, so we think that the reason for all of this is the eruption of the Siberian Traps, this very large volcanic province. And to give you a sense of scale, the Siberian Traps is something like 5 million cubic kilometers of basalt. This is enough to cover the lower 48 United States or Western Europe on the order of 400 or 500 meters deep in basalt. Right. So this is not Mount St. Helens, this is not Mount Pinatubo, this is not the Icelandic volcano that I won't try to pronounce. This is 1 million times the size of those eruptions. So, and it's not happening all at once. It's not one eruption, but it's a continuous series of giant eruptions over the span of 100,000 years or so. And so it's been known for quite a while that these basalts covered much of Siberia. It turns out basalts are much harder to date than other igneous rocks because they don't have a lot of uranium in them. And so it's been a lot of work to date these, but it turns out that radiometrically they come out at exactly the age that we just saw for the End Permian extinction. And so the age that we get from the horizons with fossils is the same age that we get when we go and date these basalts. The basalts aren't that bad news. I mean, they're very bad news locally. The basalts are a very dry rock, and so they don't emit a lot of gas into the atmosphere compared to something more explosive eruption, like a Mount St. Helens style eruption. But the Siberian Traps turn out to probably be quite unusual for these basalts in that they're also associated with a lot of explosion structures. And so if you look at this map here, the thing that you should notice, so all the purple and red, this is just the area, the modern outcrop area of the Siberian Traps. All these black dots are what geologists are interpreting as gas explosion structures. And so what's happening here essentially is this. The basalts are coming up from the Earth's mantle. They're coming into the crust. And the crust has lots of sediment on top. The key aspects of the sediment here are a whole bunch of limestones. This is calcium carbonate. A bunch of coal at the top up here in black. And a bunch of evaporites. These are things like calcium sulfate. Right? So when you heat these rocks up, you produce things like carbon dioxide gas, sulfur dioxide gas. You can produce halocarbons. You can produce things like fluorinated methane and things like this. So things that destroy the ozone layer, essentially. And the idea that Henrik Svensson and his colleagues at the University of Oslo have come up with is that if we start with those sediments, we start sticking in basalt here with a temperature of 1400 degrees Celsius, that's going to start to dissociate the sediments into gas, and that's going to create gas pressure into the rocks that are lying above. Eventually, that gas pressure is going to exceed the overburden pressure, and the whole thing's going to blow out in a big hole. Right? So you get this big blast of gas into the atmosphere, and then it's going to fill in with a crater lake. The reason that those are known all over Siberia is that the Russians were really interested in them because they turn out to create metal ores, right? Things like iron ores that are very useful. And so the Russians spent lots and lots of time, or the Soviets spent lots of time, mapping out where these things were and strip mining them, right? So this is one of these gas explosion structures that's been strip mined, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them across Siberia. Okay. And so that's where all the gas appears to have come from for the Siberian Traps. This wasn't fossil fuel burning. This was sort of bad luck for everybody who was living in the late Permian, right? Is that we had this giant basaltic province come in, and it happens to interact with all these rocks that are rich in gases that affect climate and that affect ocean chemistry. And so that, at the moment, is our best hypothesis by a long shot for what's happening at the end of the Permian. Okay, so many commonalities here in terms of climate change, in terms of changes in ocean chemistry, in terms of what we might expect the pattern of extinction selectivity to be. Okay. It turns out that the extinction selectivity is one thing that appears to be setting the sixth extinction apart from previous extinctions. And this is something that we're working on right now. So again, I'll apologize and just show you some ugly graphs so that you can see what I've been thinking about with some colleagues. First, a nice graph. So this is actually by a colleague in biology, Rodolfo Dirzo and his colleagues. And they're reproducing in this graph. This is a review paper reproducing data from previous studies showing that, for example, in terrestrial mammals, mammals that went extinct during the Pleistocene have a very, very different size distribution from mammals that went extinct during the Anthropocene, so the last 500 years, which are in turn larger than the mammals that are threatened, considered threatened today, but still around, which are in turn much larger than the mammals that are around and considered not threatened. Right? So mammal extinction over the last 10,000 years has a very, very strong size selectivity gradient to it. When we go into the fossil record and try comparing the marine extinctions in the past to what we see in the modern for things that are threatened, we see similar kinds of unusual patterns. So for example, if you look up here, what we've graphed here is a coefficient which is relating size to extinction risk. And so you don't need to worry about the details. We've done this for a whole bunch of events from 70 million years ago up to the present day. And what you can see is basically 0 means there's no association. You can see that in the modern, there's a very strong association between size and extinction risk in the ocean. So bigger things are at much higher risk of extinction than smaller things. That doesn't appear to have been the case during any of the extinction events over the last 70 million years in the oceans. Being pelagic, so living up in the water column versus living on the seafloor, doesn't seem to matter in the modern. Seems to have mattered a lot at the end of the Cretaceous. That's that one point that's way up here. Being predatory versus not predatory doesn't seem to matter too much. Being motile seems to matter. So if you move around, you seem to be at much higher extinction risk in the modern than if you don't move around in your adult life form. So what we wanted to do is to figure out a way to represent all of this, to summarize each time interval as one data point. And so we did something called principal components analysis. So this is basically just taking all of this information and trying to represent it as best possible in a single plane. And so the key things that you see here then, basically every number on here is a time interval. And here is the end Cretaceous mass extinction. So you can see the end Cretaceous is an outlier, right? It was not only very intense in terms of the number of extinction, but it was also unusual in terms of selectivity. And here's the modern, right? So the modern in terms of selectivity is already looking like a mass extinction. It has the kind of unusual selectivity that we see in past mass extinction events. The reason I didn't run this farther back in time is to do this analysis well, we had to limit it to the groups that have been assessed in the modern. And that leaves out a lot of groups that are very diverse in the Permian and Triassic. And so trying to run this back to the Permian and Triassic doesn't give very good results because we're excluding much of the data. So it does work pretty well if you go back to the end Cretaceous extinction. So we can see that, so all of these are everything between the end Cretaceous and the modern. And you can see that the modern looks nothing like any of those extinctions in between. And so when we think about the Anthropocene as a new time interval in the geological record, the selectivity signal says that this could be a whole new era, right? This isn't just the end of the Holocene, but this is the end of the Cenozoic, which is the last 65 million years. Okay, so the Sixth Extinction looks much like a mass extinction in terms of how extinction is being distributed, though not like the previous ones, right? It seems similar in the sense that it's an outlier, but it doesn't closely resemble any of the previous ones. Okay. And the very last thing I wanted to touch on is that the last thing we learned from the fossil record is that biotic recovery takes a long time. So for example, I spent much of my PhD work in South China trying to compile records of recovery from the End Permian extinction. And the most exciting thing that we found is in this carbon isotope record that here's the End Permian extinction. It turns out that there were a lot of environmental disturbances during the next 5 million years. And it took a long time for diversity and body size to recover. So we're looking at a 5 million year time horizon for getting back towards something that is as functional as the Permian. If we go to the end of the Cretaceous and we look at a carbon record there and we look at changes in diversity, we basically get the same lesson. It's about 3 million years from the end of the Cretaceous to when we get back to ecosystems that are really functioning the way they were beforehand. So when these events happen, recovery times are very long, right? In the 500 million year sense, things recover, right? We have more diversity today than we had before the End Permian extinction or before the End Cretaceous. So recovery does happen, but the time horizon to getting there is measured in millions of years, not thousands or hundreds of thousands. Okay, so I was thinking about this in terms of human structures, right, and being inspired by being in Italy, right? And when you think about the things that humans are doing, right, our structures last hundreds to thousands of years, right? The carbon dioxide that we're adding to the atmosphere, especially if we add a lot and basically take away the ability of the ocean to absorb that carbon dioxide, that'll last for 100,000 years or more. Right? So we can get our signal of carbon dioxide will last much longer than our buildings and our written records. It'll be here for 100,000 years, and there's basically nothing we can do to change that situation. But again, the thing that I think we learned from this is that, whether positive or negative, what we do to the diversity, the biological diversity on this planet, will last much longer than anything else that our species does. So, the question is, how smart are we, right? And so, in psychology, one of the key experiments for figuring out how smart an animal is to figure out if it passes the mirror test. Right, which is, does it recognize that it's looking at itself as opposed to just another individual of its species? Right? And so apes, for example, pass the mirror test. If you knock them out, drug them so they're knocked out, put a little bit of paint on their hair, and they look in a mirror, they start touching their own head because they realize that what they're seeing is that somebody painted their face. Right? So, what I think is amazing about human ability is that we've been looking up at the stars for a long time. Right? We've been looking out into space. And almost exactly 2 years to the day from when I was born, we launched the Voyager 1 spacecraft to go out and take a look at Saturn and Jupiter. And in 1980, at the same time that the Alvarez group was discovering destruction from above, Carl Sagan suggested that they turn the Voyager around and take a picture of Earth. It turned out for technical reasons, mostly fearing that they were going to fry the cameras by looking at the sun, by looking back toward Earth, they didn't do it. And it took 10 more years for them to turn the Voyager around, but they did do it in 1990. At that point I was not 2, but I was in high school. And this is the picture that they got. Okay. So out in space, can anyone find Earth? Right, right there, right? That's us, right? And that's all of human history. That's all of the history of the planet. And we're this tiny little dot sitting out in the middle of space. And this is just in our own solar system. Right? Voyager has since actually left the solar system. Right? It was very recently that it left the heliosphere, sort of the area that the sun strongly influences. So we can not only look out into space, but now we've gained the ability to look back at ourselves. Unfortunately, the Voyager cameras have been turned off at this point, but we have had that ability now to see ourselves from this kind of distance. And what I think is amazing about geology, right, is that we can do the same thing, right? We can look back into time and understand what these rocks are telling us about events that happened tens or hundreds of millions of years previously. Right? And so when we look at that End Permian extinction horizon, we can see what was happening on our planet 250 million years ago. What we don't know yet, right, is what we're going to look like a billion years from now. And so, to me, that's one of the really exciting things about looking back into time is that it can give us a new perspective on how we're changing the planet and how those effects may or may not last.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Thank you so much. Professor Payne will take a couple of questions, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And here's the microphone. I'm sorry. Okay.
First of all, thank you for a very insightful talk. looking into the mirror as humans today, what kind of risk assessment might you have done in terms of what humans have to do to reduce our risk, our pressure on the Earth, both biogeochemical, habitat loss, all the selective reduction of species in the oceans and so forth. Not only what we have to do to reduce carbon emissions, but all these other threat factors we have on ecosystems.
Yeah. So that's a hard question. I'm not a policy person, and I'm not really even a modern person, right? I spend most of my time thinking about the Permian. But
policy's based on good science.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I think that the key thing that I see coming out of the work that we're doing is that when you take the long view, the species that are deeply at risk of extinction today, those aren't the ones that we need to be worried about if we're worried about what our long-term impact is on biodiversity. What we really need to be worried about is figuring out what are the species that are likely to be at risk in a century or 2 centuries that we don't even think are at risk right now. And I think that we can use the fossil record and both the similarities and the differences between the fossil record and the modern to try to figure out what are the best predictors of extinction risk. Is it geographic range? Is it body size? Is it what you make your shell out of? And so if we can figure those out based on what we know the environmental changes are going to be, then we can create better conservation strategies that are targeted toward the aspects of life history or physiology that we think are what create the most risk. That, again, that won't be easy because, of course, there are all kinds of competing priorities, and making governments actually function is
that
hard.
thinking going on among your colleagues at Stanford?
Yeah. So, fortunately, I have many very, very knowledgeable colleagues who are spending all of their time thinking about how do we advocate for and create effective conservation strategies. One of the areas, I focused almost all this on the marine record because that's what I study. The good news is, the oceans are in better shape right now than the land is in terms of diversity loss, but they're also much less studied. And so I think one of the big challenges is figuring out how we create effective strategies for conservation in the oceans where, unlike the land, it's not all controlled by individual governments, it's controlled by international policies and treaties, and so we have a much more challenging situation there, and the animals, of course, don't obey political boundaries either, right? They follow the currents or wherever their migration patterns lead them, and so we need to figure out, how to deal with those things as well.
Any other questions?
If you don't mind, I have another one. You mentioned that the worst case scenario was assuming that what has been studied is representative of the rest of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Why is that worst case? That seems to me like that might be normal case.
Yeah. So obviously, things could be even worse than that. The reason that I think that it's close to a worst case scenario is that much of aside from the few groups that have been completely assessed, in the other groups, generally what's happening is the first things to be assessed are things that we know already or we think have some risk. And so when we find out that 40% of clams are at risk of extinction, part of that may be that 40% of clams are really at risk of extinction, but a component of that is probably that we've chosen to start with the ones that we think are at risk.
Subjective selectivity.
Exactly. And so these are non-random samples of what's out there. And so, again, for terrestrial systems, for mammals and birds, there's been at least a first assessment of every species as far as I understand. And so then we know what the risk is. But for a lot of these marine groups, we have very small samples, and they're probably not representative samples.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And we have a small